I love. Hello. I love audiences where everybody's friends already. Sorry to interrupt you. All right, awesome. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here. How many of you are joining us at the Center for Fiction for the first time this evening? Two people. Welcome. um, that's awesome. The Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit whose mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. And we do this through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. Through our Kids Read program, we offer immersive reading experiences for kids. And by supporting early career writers with our first novel prize and our emerging writing fellowship. Please sure to get tickets, for those of you who are here, if you haven't already, to Mateo Ascarapor's event on July 8th. And while you're on the site, sign up for our mailing list and follow us on social media. To support our work, creating a home for readers and writers in Brooklyn, please consider becoming a member so that you're tuned into all of our activities and come back and see us soon. A couple of logistics for tonight. After the conversation, we'll have a Q&A. And if you're here, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. That's so that the guests on the live stream can hear your question as well. And for those of you on the live stream, hello. Please add your question to the chat at any time and we'll read one of those before we break for the signing line. Joseph was kind enough to pre-sign all the books and we'll be doing a personalization line after the event. So stick around, grab a drink after. We're here tonight, of course, to celebrate God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, the propulsive, electric, funny, hard, and tender debut novel by our featured guest tonight, Joseph Earl Thomas. Yeah. He is joined in conversation with the 2023 Center for Fiction First Novel Prize winner, the author of We Are a Haunting, Tyriek White. Y'all, please give him a very warm welcome.
How y'all doing?
What's up? Thank y'all for coming.
Such a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the Center for Fiction for, of course, having me, but of course, invite my homie Joseph Earl Thomas, who I've had the pleasure of reading his memoir, Sink, which if you haven't gotten, you should go out and get. It's incredible. Um, but man, really just to see the sort of the culmination, the sort of height of your powers, so to speak. But not even, because this is your debut novel. Um, so yeah, um, how about we sort of get a taste of um, a bit of the novel, if you want
Gotcha.
to read a particular section or.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning. I'll say the whole novel itself takes place over one shift at an emergency department in Philly. For a long time, I worked in healthcare. That was like my main real job before going to switching up to writing. And thank you, for being willing to talk to me at the Tyreek White Center for Fiction. I've been calling it that ever since you got the prize. Every other day, but I appreciate it though. I appreciate it, man.
Of course, man.
So I'll start. It has two epigraphs up at the beginning. By choosing and extolling certain models to the exclusion of all others, he sought to deny the impending crisis of his own self representation. And that's from John Keane in Annotations. And there's another one. So you say you're under a curse? Well, so what? So's the whole damn world. And that's Jigo to Prince Ashitaka from Princess Mononoke. Of all the level one trauma centers in one young, though very old nation, it's this one, on the north side of a northeastern middling city where we wear teal scrubs stained with shit, which, in this context, helps signify the unbearability of true pleasure in the world. Pleasures in feeling purposeful and needed and useful without forcing the disambiguation. The waiting room is full. In the trauma bay, bright lights illuminate the bleached out blood stains and pennies thrown across the tile floor. A small boy is shot through the thigh again with an AK 47, and next door, a teenage girl from Temple is sexually assaulted. This homeless dude, Greg, who everybody loves to love hate, is beaten to near death outside a gas station by teenagers who are not yet shot through their daddy's deep blue Crown Vics with AK 47s at Sunoco on Broad and Lehigh, or Hess on Shelton Ave, or Exxon by the Home Depot where I once worked in the lawn and garden section, and Hector and them waited outside by the truck for gigs, playing ball with every single mom's little kids on that Fisher Price court in front of where Lorenzo and Julia made those banging ass Italian sausages. He started coming here too, Lorenzo. A few years ago, after his first heart attack, back when he could walk in without the oxygen tank in tow. There's one boy who, just last week, strolled in dressed down in all white on his way to his party at Broad and Bad News Champlos, is in need of penicillin again. He's dragged in by a correctional officer. Both of them, him and the officer, a girl I went to high school with, rocking late in life barrettes who every teen and two gym teachers called bad, were both coughing up a lung, just backthroat spitting on everybody from the waiting room and through the hallway, from the window to the walls and past the egg white cashier's counter. All together makes me remember that one time she had burnt our point guard and was like, my bad, in public, to wild laughter that lasted all year. That same year, Sean Paul and Busta Rhymes forever christened the colloquialism for getting burnt. Make it clap. And this, the reclaiming of our 24 points per game averaging stars pride would then take a back seat to a more historically salient reenactment, because too soon after, this white girl at an away game ran around asking everybody on the court and in the bleachers if she could give them head. And, despite our best efforts, he gave in. Needy. What an obvious mistake. After which she informed her boyfriend down court that our point guard had raped her, thus vanishing our sports star into the system like my younger brother after he slapped the taste out of his teacher's mouth for choking him one Wednesday afternoon because he was 3 minutes late to his 10th grade social studies class. They both left behind kids and girlfriends, one of whom, Tasha, is a nurse manager now, on her way out the door after a long night shift and reminding me that my scrubs are fucking high waters, bro. And I remind her to mind her fucking business, and she says I love you too, and I say that's why I'm not watching your badass kids no more. One of whom, when sleeping over, jumped from the top bunk into the ceiling fan at 2:43 a.m., cracking his almost but not quite ascension into Miles Morales. But she got a new boyfriend now, who's apparently always dreamed of being a stay-at-home type dad nigga, who I discovered only recently in our last text thread. A video of him, tall, fine, brown, and Reebok slides and every nigga deserves sweater, playing Fallout with the kids in her living room while she sat back rolling a blunt just outside on the patio. Hummingbirds gathered around her hanging feeders in a scene that, if coupled with the right soundtrack, could have made me cry.
It's incredible. The kind of tapestry you sort of like form, especially when I first opened up this book. It felt like opening credits, right, of like The Sopranos or some shit or some like HBO drama of like this like sprawling kind of bird's eye view of Philadelphia, right? But then these like very close and intimate shots of the people who occupy the city, right? Um, and on a craft level, you do this thing where you're not just every place, every restaurant or gas station or mall or all of these entities in Philly they have you know memories associated with them. They're populated. They're fully realized as you present them to us. Talk about Joseph Earl Thomas's Philly, right?
Mhm.
And also, did you learn or rediscover anything about the city as you
That's a
kind
good
of poured
question.
into it?
That's a good question. I don't know if I like. I think I was forced to remember a lot of stuff. So I I mean, even when I was writing Sync and I was interviewing family members, and that's basically how the book is constructed, right? It's like all these different people. It's not me in first person being like, I remember this or was this or whatever. It's like other people shaping the child, right? Because you don't get to make a self if you're a kid anyway, right? It's like all of what other people build about you. So that's how it worked. So I was already doing some of that stuff. So I would go to like the old place where my grandfather used to work at. I would drive up, State Road in like greater Northeast Philly, and I was interested in a lot of places that don't come up a lot when we talk about regional work, especially when we talk about Philadelphia. I mean, to some extent, when I think about Philadelphia, the two things that come up are hospitals and prisons. University, we have a lot of hospitals, universities, and prisons. And all the prisons are in like greater Northeast. So sometimes it's like, oh, this is the suburb, but it's also where all the prisons are at. And one of them is Holmesburg, right? Where famously there was these experiments carried out, like late into the 20th century, later than most people think into the 20th century, right? And I had family members who were there. So I would hear stuff back and forth. And I just graduated from the university that was where the principal investigator was at, who through whom those experiments were sponsored, right? So I was reading a lot more stuff about that place in particular. And that's where that book Acres of Skin comes in. I had read it a long time ago, but I reread it again. So I was thinking about those places, and I was thinking about places that are not, I don't like national monuments that are Googleable immediately, but places that you remember because of stuff that happened there. So places where people used to play ball at, where you get the best Chinese food at, those are the kind of places that came up over and over again for me. And it's the kind of saturation of details that I'm most invested in, because information, anybody can have information, right? But like, I'm not really that invested in being like, did you know? I'm like, no. I'm like, this is how it feels, to be moving through this or that street.
Right, right. And it's like this kind of discursive relationship with these places, with
Yeah,
these people, that it's not this static of like, hey, I remember this. It's
yeah,
like
yeah.
this living, breathing kind of, you know,
Yeah,
tapestry.
I mean, as a rule, I had like the way that I was gonna encounter places. It's like the only satisfiable relationship for them to me was, how did somebody touch that place, or how were they touched by that place. So every encounter with a person is linked to a place, or encounter with a place is linked to a person or a set of people.
Right, right. And to me, like touch and the body is so sort of important in this story, especially, this he works in a hospital. You're constantly confronted with blood or flesh or the body just doing things that it can't control,
Yeah,
and you're like kind of reveling in this. Yeah, you're also the narrator is also going through this sort of stream of conscious kind of narrative style, right? And it's like it's interesting because usually you get these styles that are just just thought after thought after thought, and it kind of takes you out of the body. But the very kind of nature, or the very plot, the very story, it places us firmly in the body. Um, let's talk a little bit about like what not only that balance of like, all right, being you know allowing the narrator to kind of just follow a
yeah.
typical train of thought, but like how did you was that a conscious effort to kind of ground us
Hmm.
in the actual like what's happening
Yeah,
step by
yeah.
step because it was so heady or
No, I mean, this is good. So it's funny because with all the complaints or arguments or discursive stuff that comes up, that's all like mental activity. I started off first thinking, what are the things that interrupt what people expect you to do or what you need to do? And one of the things, if I'm thinking about like a lot of the black folks I know, like what are the things everybody's doing is like working all the time. I was talking about this the other day when in another event where Reggie Bailey, and we was like, yeah, last week was working 75 hours, 80 hours. With other homies, like, remember when we used to work those 90, 100-hour weeks at so and so, back in the day? And I was like, there's so many things of in the way of thinking, and also there's so many things in the way of doing what you're expected to do, which is like work all the fucking time, right? Especially for some of us more than others. And the trajectory that I started building was like, okay, so you're at work and you have encounter after encounter with people, some of whom are your actual relatives, right, at the hospital, or some of which is like with food items that are very much related to memory. Um, and also, it's interesting that you have to touch so many people. When you work in when you're at a hospital or ED and you're not a physician, you spend so much time touching and talking to people over and over again, and you get the same people coming in over and over again, and so you establish these kind of unspoken really relationships with folks. And some patients won't let other people clean or touch them, right? But they'll let you do so when you establish those relationships. So I wanted to think about that while also thinking about what is in the way of thought, or like the attempt of writing a book, the expectations that I'm supposed to have, in particular, like a Black man, father, and somebody who is also in graduate school is expected to be like a public intellectual in certain kinds of ways. But there's all these other things like labor getting in the way of that. And so I decided that every encounter with a person was going to be like an encounter with memory. So every person that comes in strikes a different chord on what's possible with regards to thinking. And then in between, you get the little bit of like, okay, now I have time to write my thing or read my thing. But that time is always broken up by labor, always. It's just always having to work.
Yo, yeah, exactly. And you have like, um, it's such a clear, or like, you see how labor, or the kind of belief that like this is the only thing I can do. This is how I feed my family. This is how I keep going from day to day to day to day. You do an incredible job, like craft wise, just making us feel sort of how the body, or the main character, kind of even under this pressure, this weight, kind of it begins to break down. Or it I don't want to say crumbles, but there's
Hmm.
you see the kind of manifestations, the physical, the mental labor, the emotional labor. Like there is this kind of uh this wear, this withering, right, that you can
Yeah.
kind of follow throughout the story. I guess, can you talk about like, and you kind of touched on it, but like how
Hmm.
did you deliberately like show this? Like I know for me, like the hunger, right?
Yeah.
You notice the main character kind of isn't eating throughout this shift, and the story mainly takes place throughout this one shift. So for me, that's like where I
Yeah.
trace the trajectory. But like, what other kind of ways did you try it?
Yeah, I mean, so like both the hunger thing and the work all the time thing are both like old Black questions, right? That come up all the time. I mean, you can't be like a Black boy writer and not read Black boy, right? Like everybody's gonna shove Richard Wright in your hands at some point, or there's gonna be some kind of conversation um, about that book in particular too. But I was thinking a lot about the relationships to food stuff, and part of the inception for this book had to do with the literal Otis Spunkmeyer muffins, because it became so clear to me. I'm like, okay, my mom or friends or somebody would be coming back from prison, and it would be like, man, I really miss those muffins or whatever, right? I was in the army for a long time, and that was one of the biggest kind of free food items we would have, is like those Otis Spunkmeyer muffins, cookies, whatever. In public schools, right? You get the bag milk, and they would have those muffins, in the hospital, et cetera. I was like, damn, there's like a interesting conglomerate situation going on where the packaged food item of choice in whatever food desert or like fucked up situation where you can't get fresh produce is these kinds of things, right? So they're like a stand-in for a lot of the things that we are forced to eat anyway, either because of availability of food or because of preconceived notions of what we should have, or it's just like there's no other option, right? And then they end up, I mean, you put them in the freezer, they taste kind of good. Like if we're being real. So I wanted to build something around that, a kind of desperation for that kind of thing. And it's also like kind of short term. I think I use the term like dopamine smashing foods, right? I was eating, there's a scene there was like eating two kinds of cheesesteaks in the living room at like the family's house or whatever, right? After coming back from being gone for a long time. And it is that, right? It feels good. And that's part of the problem. A lot of shit that's fucked up feels good. Uh, and you get into a kind of repetitive cycle of doing those things because there's not that many other ways that you can easily access pleasure. And so I'm thinking you're really tired, right? You open the fridge at the nurse's station, There's like, maybe one or two orange juices, a bunch of muffins, or whatever other prepackaged thing that we can use as a stand-in, and then the kind of cycle continues, right? And you get more tired from eating that shit in the first place.
Right.
Yeah,
Why?
yeah,
Why does like there's like an intersection of like three, you know, so schools, prisons, hospitals, right? Like there's so many overlaps in terms of
and the
like
military, yeah,
in
yeah,
military,
yeah,
in terms of food, in terms of like you walk into a public school, it sort of looks like a prison mess hall
yeah,
or like there's these institutions kind of I don't know share like Venn diagrams, the center of Venn diagrams, which is interesting,
yeah,
especially when navigating all of them as you do kind of in the story. And the hospital as a space, I think brings in like there's so much for you to talk about, right? Because you're getting
yeah,
people from all over the city. You're getting people that you grew up with. You're getting like all of these, from gunshot trauma to the things that we eat that manifest in high blood pressure and diabetes. Like a lot of the patients share um, the kind of like disenfranchisement that occurs with being poor or working class or being black and brown in sort of a northeastern city. Like there's so much collapsing of these spaces and of these things, um, and the hospital is like the perfect place to
yeah.
sort of write about
I
it.
was talking I was talking to my homegirl the other day and being like, that's one of the few places where you get people from different class backgrounds intermingle, because if you include like the people who work there, otherwise like the city is so segregated, so intensely segregated and becoming more segregated that you like might go to the university but you don't know anybody in the rest of the city, even though the claim is of that space or whatever.
Um, I mean, you mentioned it, so let's talk about Holmesburg, right? I don't know how many of y'all heard of Holmesburg Prison. Um, it casts such a shadow over this entire story because the protagonist is seeing all the tops, red top, black top, white top, these characters, but these older black men who um, were victims of being in this place, and we're talking about performing experiments on inmates. This is written about. There's so much literature out there about it. Um, I guess what is that split between, right? Like when you write the thing, right? And you
Hmm.
know the thing in your body, right? And your OGs have been through this, or like, the people closest to you that you
Hmm.
love or don't love have been through this. How do you write about this, but balance it with sort of the patience and the amount of research it takes to kind of get the thing right?
Yeah, I mean, the jury's out, like whether one gets it right or something like that.
Yeah,
We could always contest that. I don't
think
know.
you did. I think you
I
did.
think I mean, I like that you said that you love or don't love, because that's a question that I think I want the book to be asking too, which is, you know, uh, as a kind of broader set of problems, you have somebody who did something really fucked up. You feel a certain kind of pride in admonishing that thing as horrible. That person is then in prison, and then you're tasked with caring for that person, whether through family relation or because it's your job. Like you earn an hourly wage also by caring through them. But then you also see other people treat them even more poorly after they come from the prison
Mm.
where you already are getting treated. So I wanted to kind of thread that needle and to think about what is your responsibility or the way that you should behave in those situations, not as like an abstraction, but in a kind of interpersonal way or space. For context, because Philly has so many, between prison and hospitals, you have people coming in and out, not just like from the neighborhood that you live in, but people cycling through who get sick or injured at like a nearby prison. And in this instance, in the book, there's like family members and family friends who come through in that cycle. Some of whom have done one horrible things and are also being treated horribly and being experimented on from people like Johnson and Johnson and like Dow Chemical. It's like there's a lot of ridiculous. They could seem ridiculous. Hindsight always lets you make things, let you see things as ridiculous. But scientific articles on the kind of successes of the experiments, or like what we discovered about this shampoo or X skin cream or whatever thing that made people's fingernails fall off, etc. And so there are characters who are embodying those experiences. But I think for me, it's thinking about the interpersonal stuff. So what do people actually say? Not what the principal investigator said or what the actual article said, but what sometimes the people say. And I always use the example. Sometimes when you talk to folks, they're like, "Look, I'm not as fucked up as I seem, but I just needed to get out of there for a little bit. Can you not mark down these things in my chart so that I can stay here longer? Because this is better than being back over there." Right. So I'm interested in those kinds of moments between people. And then, like kind of skirting the thing and being like, all right, you can stay, whatever. Like, you want a warm blanket and some food? Go ahead. The food is the muffins most of the time, right? Unless you can get something else. But I'm interested in that level of discourse
Right.
rather than the kind of broader, you can find it on JSTOR kind of discourse.
Right. No, and that's I think what makes it like so impactful, so heartbreaking, so um comical in moments because you be the protagonist don't be showing no love to none of these patients. I mean, unless it's like a child or like whatever. He said to one person like, "Oh, oh you got a high blood pressure, nigga. You gonna pass away anyway." Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but like I say that to say that this book, although it's like charged with these you know this history, these sort of heavy kind of moments, it's still a joy to read. It's still super funny in certain spots, um, just in your truthfulness, and also just like your willingness to say anything.
But wait, y'all don't say. Okay, so this is the question.
Good,
Y'all
good,
don't
good.
be so. All right, so my grandfather, he passed away last year, and the whole time when he was, I mean, that's how we would talk to her. I'd be like, I would go in there and I would see him, I don't know, putting all this damn salt in the grits or some shit like that. And I'll be like, nigga, you got high blood pressure. You gotta chill a little bit, like this is what, like, and it wasn't like
Listen,
to diminish him, but it was just to be straight
listen.
up like,
We
why are,
we
like,
be
what's going
we be joke about the
That's
gout.
what I'm saying. Yeah.
Like, oh,
Yeah.
niggas got gout in here, like like
Right,
there.
right.
But I guess I'm asking this to sort of like why don't we take nothing seriously, but also a deeper kind of deeper rhetorical
Yeah.
question, right, of blackness and how we engage with kind of these serious um traumas that we go through, right? um
I
yeah,
mean,
like what do you
I think that, like self seriousness is to some degree overrated. I don't think that there's a kind of, for one, like no new information is being revealed, right? There's no, it's not like no work has been done to ask these kinds of questions before, but I'm thinking primarily about intimacy and lack of sentimentality, not to create a portrait of like, woe is me or woe is someone else or woe is this person under the guise that like some random liberal is gonna like take pity and change the way they vote, change the way they think, change the way they treat me in public spaces. I am just not a person who thinks that that is what's gonna happen from that venue. So my interest is what are the kinds of pleasure in language in exchanges that we have. Like that's the thing that I really care about. Not necessarily trying to vie for, whether somebody is gonna make the death of my family member a federal holiday or something like that or whatever, or give or hand out some breadcrumbs that are going to make me feel better symbolically for 20 minutes while also not actually being interested in repair or reparation in any real way. So for me the excitement is in the kind of intimate exchange and not the other stuff.
Yeah, no, that's dope, and it comes across in kind of in the writing. Speaking of which, like, you know I guess I think about kind of you mentioned Acres of Skin, you mentioned Soul on Ice. You mentioned Survival Math. Um, you mentioned so much more. I guess what sort of authors, books,
Mhm.
media in general informed a lot of this? Like, what were you reading? What were you excited by? What drove you every day, sort of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so a lot of this book, I guess the first parts of it, I had started so long ago, even before I had started Sync. So there's
Okay.
like a longer lineage of like what I had been reading. I know that as of most recently, I can think of several books that come to mind. We talked about like the lack of like new hood dramas or whatever, like because Top Boy is
Yeah.
done and like
Snowfall's done.
Snowfall's done. So we talked about that a little bit. But books wise, so Gail Jones' book Mosquito that came out in '99 that a
Mm,
lot of
right,
people
you put me on to that.
yeah, seem to not like. But that when you read that, that sounds like just like a couple black people talking. And she's funny as hell in that book. But
Mm,
there's so much conflict, but she's also incredibly funny.
right,
And I love that that kind of mode of thinking so much. And a lot of it is also about this distance between like, theory, high theory scholarship, whatever kind of intellectual practices and what people do in real life with and to each other and how you think about that beyond just being like, well, have you read so and so's book? Like, yes, people probably have read that, but actually, like, you still have to pay your rent, etc. And there's lots of people who I know who will die having never read a book at all. And so I'm also thinking about those folks, right? And you know what I mean, but that you love, that you have exchanges with. I was reading Simone White's book, Or on Being the Other Woman, which I think is an incredible book for thinking about how you might revise syntax. It's also got so much direct interest in conflict and in confrontation
right.
that is not incredibly sentimental, that is doing a lot of thinking on the page in real time. Stephen Dunn's book Potted Meat
Yeah.
also is another one. So there's a couple that come readily to mind, but over the course of it, it was dozens and dozens of books, I would
Right,
say.
right. No, I'm just curious about like kind of like because sync doesn't read like this. You know, this is very very distinct, and of course it's different genre, but you doing a whole metafiction, so like um let's talk about sex a little bit. It's a lot of sex in this book. Um, with the kind of intimacy that you speak about, the kind of proximity to bodies and all of these things. Of course, sex would play
Yeah.
a huge part of that. Garth Greenwell, he says, sex as inextricable from philosophy. It is a source of all of our metaphysics. It's the experience that puts us most in our animal bodies and yet also gives us our most intense intimations and thinking about something beyond those bodies. So I guess my question, um, and it made me think, that quote made me think a lot about your work. So I guess my question is, you know, what craft choices went into thinking about
Yeah.
um, and writing a lot of these sex scenes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like short or clipped in part because I didn't, and I like Garth's work as well too. Um, was thinking about what avenues of pleasure that one has access to.
Mhm.
It's like food, sex, kind of obvious, on the kind of hierarchy of needs and desires or whatever.
Right.
And working, in situations like in hospitals, are of course oftentimes a very sexually charged atmosphere, quite cartoonishly depicted in things like
Grey's
Scrubs or
Anatomy.
Grey's Anatomy, that kind of cartoonish stuff sometimes. But to some extent, like true, if you put enough grown people of around the same age in a place and their colleagues, of course, that naturally
Everybody
happens.
got a work boot,
Yeah,
work
exactly. Yeah,
day.
yeah, yeah. Work boo goes to the next level. For me, I was trying, for one, not to kind of romanticize them or position sex as, this thing that one aspires to, that is supposed to like transform the world in which you live, right? Because I think that that's the ties that, you connect to or connect to someone, you then enter into a relationship that changes the world for you. I mean, and certain ideals, right? It's like you have two people paying rent. Is a kind of real world mode of thinking about that. But I wanted it to be like, okay, there's lots of people in this book who desire sex, but actually do not desire this kind of long-term partnership, or do not want to. And everybody is not being harmed by it. Sometimes people are being harmed by it, right? Sometimes it's ambiguous about what people really want. They don't always necessarily know. There's like forms of experimentation that come out of that. So the most important thing for me was to have a plethora of thinking about sex in particular, but not to completely, have this fantasy in which, sex is the revolution, or like the art or the dancing or the whatever the case is the revolution
Right.
that
Right.
then reshapes the world, right? That
Yeah.
requires much more work and labor than the thing that gives you pleasure.
Hmm.
And you should also be skeptical of the things that give you that kind of pleasure immediately, because
Mm.
oftentimes they do
Right.
come out on the other end as like cause and harm.
Right. Right. I mean, and you sort, you sort of do that because I love the way you write about these kind of physically intimate moments because it's not all pretty. It's not all glitter and gold. It's not.
Some of it is, some of it is,
I
some
mean,
of it, yeah. I
it's
mean,
yeah, but a lot of it is very 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 true to nature, um, and also just like raw and visceral and just like in somebody's bedroom and like it's very like grounded. Um, so I really enjoyed a lot of the sexual stuff for some reason I don't know. Um, so I have a question about parenting.
mhm.
Your parent, um, your protagonist, um, has this crisis of sort of his own parents being confronted with his own parents who have
Mhm.
you know uh, been swept into the hospital, this setting. Um, there's this quote on page 162. It's my art, so it might be a different page. But at one point you say, and so I think I died then a little at the loss of certain futures together, she and I, me and her, being a parent, being parented, being a people, being a happy people, alive. Um, there's so much like attention to, or not attention, but like there's so much, and this comes into play with Sync as well. But like you give such interiority to the children in this book. You make strides to show how this protagonist is trying to nurture that interiority
Mhm.
and that inner life. Um, I guess can you speak to sort of the protagonist's relationships with their parent and also their children, and how this kind of cycle of, um, you know, I guess how you don't want to be parented
Right,
plays
right.
into how you want to parent.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible ultimately, I think, there's like nothing you can do. I mean, you can make endless attempts at failure or whatever. I think for context, protagonist has a couple children, also a mother who is very close to him in age, a father who's like one of the people at Holmesburg who is eventually cycling through the hospital. I think, the difficulty is for one, not knowing. And I think it's a disconnect that you can have with anybody you love, which is, they can be putting in a lot of work trying to love you, and it can still not feel that way. It can be not a way that you want or need to be loved, essentially, no matter how exhausted they might be about it, right? Like, I tried
Right.
this, I did this, or whatever. And then you can also be doing that with your kids, and they can be like, I fucking hate you, get away from me. you know and that happens, I mean, especially, at certain ages, right? It could be like either 6, 13, 8, whatever. And I wanted to talk about that without transforming those scenes into like Disney Pixar moments of of false revelation or something
Right,
like that,
right,
right?
right.
Like queuing up the music and being like, well, and then we all remediated everything and everything was okay, right? For me, there's like absolute moments of failure where you can't push past a certain boundary, even with someone like your child, in the same way that that attempt is being done, let's say, by a parent who did not have the tools they needed to be your parent at a time. And so there are, there are plenty of times, I think, like in real life, where I'm trying to have a conversation with my kids. I'm like, I really need you to just, clean your room and then we're going to get in the bath. And they're like, absolutely not, under no circumstances. I'm not doing this homework. You kind of run out of options, you can't. I mean, I'm talking about in my house in particular, right? Like, I'm not in here beating kids. Um, but there's a way where you have to swallow your pride so much, you just have to eat it every single time and try again to convince them to be even remotely reasonable about something. And sometimes the remediation is just you making another attempt and developing a certain kind of patience, right? Figuring out, knowing them well enough that you can entice them with what they do want, uh, and then build a situation around which the things that they need or that we collectively need in the house to happen. I mean, this is not foreign to other kinds of intimacy, but I'm talking specifically in the situation with regards to children. And the mother in the book and the father and a lot of other figures who would be parents, let's say, are often trying to do a kind of thing that they might see on TV or whatever kind of, Brady Bunch type aesthetic perhaps would have occurred, that fails because it is not true or real enough, and it is purely sentimental, and the sentiment gets in the way of what people actually need and want. And I think that I'm trying not to create a literature that does that, because I often see a confluence between what the kind of Disney, Pixar, Brady Bunch, whatever thing is happening, and how we are expected to write about similar things in the work.
Yeah, I mean, you do a beautiful job, and like the entire kind of story, even though it's this day filled with these like, memories of, this kind of you know, sketch of this person's life at this moment in time. I think a lot of the book is like searching and discovering that need, or like, or how do I need to be loved,
Yeah,
right? Or how do I need, not necessarily to love other people, but how do I love other people, and also kind of in a fulfilling
yeah,
and kind of true to self way for
yeah.
myself, that's also healthy for me, um, which I enjoyed. Do you want to read that little
Yeah, yeah, I can read.
passage
Yeah, I
and
can read
kind of?
another part of it. You have a question about this other section, okay?
Yeah.
This is like 3/4 of the way through the book, and it's just about the time that the mother enters the hospital. So basically the way it's structured is every time somebody enters, there's like a passage that starts up in relation to a memory or a set of experiences that happened with them prior, and then kind of back into what's happening in real time in the hospital, which is in present tense. When I was a young boy, my mother was never diagnosed with anything because diagnoses were not something one was offered, confusing the whole project of imagining a stable enough relationship with healthcare to be made transparent, classified, calcified, and even treated. And what measures were there anyway to ensure her interior life had not first been subject to the catastrophes of the world and could otherwise be justified by something like chemical imbalance? What I did know was that she scared me, and that she was prone to fits of rage and hitting, that she was addicted to crack like most of her friends, and now some of my friends, that she was treated poorly, and that she treated us poorly. As an adult, I had dedicated most of my time, money, and resources I could muster to her. The last time she returned from prison for stabbing this one John who didn't pay, she seemed exuberant, fat, healthy. I didn't want her to go back to Frankfurt again, and even at that time, could admit how such geographic slippage would turn out. So she came to stay with me. She had a new girlfriend, too. This new woman made her happy. My mother, who used to fuck men in the corner of my bedroom for money and who laughed when my aunt told us she was a sex worker for selling nudes on the internet. My mother, who had even less respect for authority than I did, who stole whatever whenever she wanted. My mother, who scowled with hatred anytime we talked about the people who looked like us at my university, quote, producing knowledge about what it meant to look like us. My mother, who was never happy, who was never safe, I remembered being happy then. We were driving to her PO's office when she asked me, Joey, can you teach me how to eat pussy? What? I said, turning to her, a little confused, but also confused about why I was confused. How to eat pussy, damn it, she laughed. I didn't met them girls. I know you know. And I suppose then that she was talking about the interrogations. My mother loved to show up at my house out of the blue and interrogate whoever I was dating or sleeping with as a matter of course, and because we were so close in age growing up together, I never found it strange. The gift my mother has given me was not for certain care, but the odd quality of disavowing so much of the proprietary norming we undergo in the American project. And in this, a break with all conception that any woman or girl, let alone any man, would ever take care or responsibility for my well being. That it should ever be any woman's task to tend to me, let alone purchase my flight home from college or clean my house, cook my meals, or help me survive at all. She made it clear, not by what she said or knew, but the haphazard sharing of her experience and subsequent treatment of me, how ridiculous those forms of comportment, not always captured by the market or the astute liberal intellectual, are, because they are not big enough political programs. And from this vantage point, neither are we, lacking in labor power or revolutionary potential at all. Whenever I dated fat women, my mother asked why I only loved fat women. Or was skinny the inverse? Whenever I dated a man, my mother would ask me about anal sex and if this was the reason my bedroom smelled weird. Whenever I dated people who were neither man nor woman, my mother thought I was confused and said so, called anyone out of their gender whenever she wanted without malice, though sometimes with great confusion. First, for the freedom she saw denied to her at every angle, and later, for the grand ascension she felt of pronouns over proteins. She'd ask after so many drag shows with her butch girlfriend what the big deal was when she made a mistake, and some amalgam of middle class persons on the street went so far and so hard towards shaming and embarrassing her for said mistake. If a woman I dated was too old, she'd ask why I was fucking some old lady. She got money? She asked my ex if I was any good in bed, and she was like, well, 8 out of 10 during the day, 6 out of 10 at night. You got to catch him around lunchtime, she said. And the two of them sat in the kitchen, cackling and eating all my damn fried whiting. My mother was never one to lionize her own power or peculiarities, nor feign her own innocence. But she underestimated how much I respected that, how rare it was in my own world, and instead, she tried and failed to mother me repeatedly. It was never her skill or interest, but pure sentimental imposition that we both hated, even if only I admitted it.
I had a question, but that passage is so beautiful. I think we should transition to Q and
Skip
A
it. You guys me
because
later.
I ask you later. um, yeah. So, anyone have any burning questions that they would like to ask about Joseph Earl Thomas's incredible book? Um,
So I have a
What's
question.
up?
Um, First of all, you convinced me that you're authentically Philly when you said that something about two kinds of cheesesteak. In New York, we only have one, and that's deli. But the question I had to do with
Yeah.
rhythm. So especially the first passage you read, it was clear that rhythm was a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
And um, and it's a different rhythm from the second passage you read. And I wondered what place rhythm has in this book. And I say that especially because I read first pages aloud a lot
Hmm.
to hear rhythm, and a lot of times it's not there. Which there are other ways of writing apart from rhythm, but I'm just attached to
Yeah.
rhythm.
I mean, you wasn't saying any names, so I was like, cool.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
judging. Yeah.
yeah. And I wonder when it's authentic, it's not just to be rhythmic, right? There's something driving it, and I
Yeah.
wonder what drives the rhythms of your book, your writing. Is it space? Is it characters? Is it emotions? What is it that drives these different rhythms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is also related to time and such as well, but I think the biggest thing is how people talk, not how, I mean, this is an example I never read when I was younger because the books that people tried to force me to engage with, usually stuff that like won X award or whatever kind of case may be, or it was like uplift literature, most of which, this is like an old kind of reconstruction problem. Everybody that, is literate is trying to tell you what you should do to be a like proper person, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't sound like anybody I had ever met or that I had ever wanted to talk to in any circumstance. And I always kind of wondered why we invented a certain kind of diction for capital L literature that didn't seem to me very intelligent in the way that it was being described to me as like this is the greatest thing since sliced bread or whatever. So at some point, for me, the writing becomes a confluence between what's going on in my head, like how my brain works with language, and what I'm listening to, usually rap music, almost always rap music, and like hyper sentimental R&B that I sometimes think is funny, but also love deeply, right? Like it's like a weird situation there, and the way that other people talk in different settings. So, for example, the way that my mom talks at home versus the way that your parent talks on the phone to the social worker or something like that, like those kind of different voices. So I'm usually threading the needle between those two things, and the book slows down a lot when I'm in a long-term conversation with a particular person, and then speeds back up when it's more just in the head. Which I mean, I hope that answers the question a little bit to some degree. Okay.
It's that rap, man. It's that rap, that rap music. Anyone else?
Thank you. What's up, guys?
What's up?
Quick question. I'm really interested in like the conceit. Like it
Yeah.
seems like a really awesome idea. Thinking about all of these people who in your life, whether present or past, that come back into this one shift, and understanding a little bit about kind of hospital culture. How did you decide to say, okay, look, I'm gonna do all of this in one kind of shift? There's multiple shifts. We were talking
Hmm.
earlier about all the hours that medical personnel work. How did you make that decision? And as a result of that, does it were you reaching for something surreal to kind of create something that you know maybe is could happen, but are you pushing towards
Yeah.
something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. So what I would say is the the labor that Black people have been expected to perform over at least the past 400 years is in itself surreal, and particularly in building this fucking nation. So to think about that in relation to something like a long or like 16 or 20-hour shift or whatever. I actually tried to work a 24-hour shift before, and somebody caught me and they were like, that last couple hours is not going to happen, because of like liability reasons or whatever. I think that I'm thinking on one end about like like social realist traditions, where there is a certain kind of thrust to the kinds of labor people perform, the engagements that folks have with each other, and in relation to kind of broader structures of expectations of labor too. And I think, for me, that's the challenge to say there is something surreal about it. I mean, the most surreal thing is probably like that Holmesburg prison is still open at the time that the book takes place. It's not now, but plenty of other ones are, right? And it doesn't seem the problem. The wild problem is that it doesn't seem that surreal to me for somebody to be working a 16-hour shift. But I know that there are plenty of people, especially in my current job, as like an academic intellectual, who'd be like, people have never worked a 16-hour shift before. And I'm like, here are 50 people who are currently working 16-hour shifts. So what is the gap in our imagination doing in that space when we talk about things like power? And why then do we have to keep trying to close that gap in ways that don't necessarily work out? I was also thinking about how very often in contemporary literature, there is one central problem that aims to be solved, and there's all these like kind of micro conflicts. But I was thinking that part of our problem of the present is that most people have many, many conflicts that they're simultaneously trying to solve, and kind of everybody is moving into a like contingent labor space a space of like housing insecurity, unless you got, like old money, right? Like lots of people are living in that space. So what does it mean to try and countenance that kind of psychic space? Well, it means that you are at one time always consistently thinking about work and all the other hosts of responsibilities, at least the people that I'm thinking about in particular in this way. And I thought that at first I was like, oh, you could be moving from job to job or like in the different spaces, right? But it's also true that at one job, you end up extending yourself to do things that aren't even your responsibility either, because that's another symptom of the present, is that you are assigned this role, but now you're doing everything at the job. I'm sure lots of people have that experience, right? And that's another kind of, I think, condition has become ubiquitous. So I'm trying to explain all those things at once in some way.
Hey, folks. I I think some of the things that Tyreek was talking about, just threads of like parenthood, things like that. Thinking about Sync, thinking about this novel. Do a little PR. I think we got another one next year as well, and maybe
Yeah.
another
Oh,
one.
short
Short
stories next
story.
year.
And then maybe there's like I think there's like an essay collection maybe too.
Yeah, the essays are
Yeah,
next year
so,
after that. Every year, there's one a year. Yeah, that's all they'll let you get out there.
Working.
We can talk to
we're doing the
PJ
work.
about that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, someone at some point will do this work and talking about your work, but what are the ideas, themes, threads that you have found yourself um, coming back to and thinking about throughout these projects to this point, and how have you thought about exploring these ideas within different forms of the craft?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, work is of course one of them. There's a lot of stuff about work. There's a lot also of thinking about the kind of moral relations between non-working poor Black folks, who I think is like kind of like nasty to talk about now. You're like not even supposed to really talk about that, because if you do at all, it's like, what you should say is enter a mode of kind of uplift, where you should be telling people what they should do with their lives and how and under what circumstances, et cetera. So I'm really interested in that problem too. I'm interested in fantasy in all of its iterations, both like quite literally, N.K. Jemisin Fifth Season style fantasy, which are like incredible books to me.
Love that book.
And right, it's incredible. And the things that we imagine to be real in our head, but never come to fruition in practice, or kind of can't come to fruition in practice, but we keep repeating them as if they're radical or something like that. I'm like, I think it's not working. So I'm interested in all those things, and to stage confrontations with the things that we think are comfortable. I don't want to just create a conversation that is like making clear my, let's say, enemies via the kind of obvious political associations, right? But I'm interested in, I think Elaine Castillo used this phrase, I think it was either in a podcast or in her book, How to Read Now. She's like, these are family disputes. And I'm interested in the things that we say to each other, both when people are around and when they're not around. I'm primarily invested in the really messy, really sometimes loving, and also really difficult things that people that care about each other say, and not necessarily the kind of external battles that we all are kind of waging.
Anyone else?
Hey, thanks for the
Hello.
conversation. I'm just curious about like what your experience was like doing a memoir and then transitioning to novel, and like ways that you felt maybe constrained in one medium or freer between the
Yeah.
two.
I think a big one that comes up a lot that people ask is, like legal reasons, right? It would be very difficult to write some of the things that happen in this book in a strictly nonfiction mode for like obvious HIPAA Act stuff. The fact that Holmesville Prison doesn't exist anymore, and it's like a fabulation that was made up or brought back into being. It's like a kind of haunting of that place that was already there. But I think it is also true with things like narrative direction, whereby in fiction you can make things happen for the purpose of propelling a story forward, whereby you can kind of do that in nonfiction, but it's a little bit trickier. on that end. Though I think fiction is harder for me, I think, in part because I'm always in my head about, oh, you could have wrote anything and you wrote this bullshit. You know what I mean? Like versus the nonfiction, there's at least a contingency or a constraint that already precedes you, that pre-exists. Obviously, in fiction, the constraint is like your imagination, right? Which is dangerous in and of itself. But I think for me, those are kind of those are two of the bigger differences. Other than that, I think it's marketing.
Yeah.
What's up?
So, yeah, you know. I think that this has been discussed before when we went through Sync, but I again have the question now that we're discussing a fiction piece of how you find that balance between, pseudonyms aside. How do you find the balance between maintaining your artistic integrity,
Yeah.
meaning saying what you want, telling the story that seems to be true to you, versus maintaining the balance of friends? Because again, you know, people know you can read through the pseudonyms and say, this is
Yeah.
X person.
Yeah. They're like, oh, this is an amalgam of these three people, or I mean, personally, I think that kind of stuff is funny. Like, it's hilarious to me to do that. I mean, and right? You'll you would know this, but the broader thing that I think was also true about Sync is that I don't really want to maintain relationships or fake friendships with people with whom I can't speak honestly about what our relationships to each other are. It's really not worth it for me. I don't have that kind of time. Like, I have 4 kids, a million jobs. Like, if we want to be fake friends, then we don't have to talk. Ultimately, is like where I'm at. And you know that. So that's what it is on one end. On the other end, I actually would never write about someone who was adamant about, like, don't ever write, don't make a pseudonym of me, don't write about this situation or this scene or whatever. I simply won't do it. I don't think it's important enough. I think there's ways of getting around it, or ways of thinking otherwise, or what have you, that don't require you to, like, ruin someone's life or to just be mean for the sake of being mean or something like that, right? Which is kind of silly. I think what guides me often as to what I will say, when things are, like, closer to something that actually happened or something like that, is humor, usually. Because a lot of times when I'm in conversations with my friends and family, a lot of the shit that's really funny I can't let go of, and then I'm automatically recalling that even when I don't want to at a lot of times. And that ends up being the things that I will perhaps build relationships in whatever text around, or expand, sometimes like a single text message or something like that, right? So that's been my rule thus far, for the most part. That may or may not change, but I think that still holds true now, and it's going to hold true for the next 2 books until something happens otherwise.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna wrap it up here. But again, thank you to the Center for Fiction for hosting us. Let's give a round of applause for
Thank
Joseph
y'all.
Earl Thomas.
Thank
Uh,
you.
an incredible
To the,
book. Please go out and get that.
Thank you to the Tyreek White Center for Fiction.
We'll see you
Oh my
soon.
God. So if you don't have a copy yet, I know you're just dying to get your hands on one. So go on and do that, and then meet us right on the other side of this wall to get it personalized if you want to. The bar will also be serving for a little bit. Thank you all so much for coming.